Veteran Caleb's peace was shattered when his loyal dog, Kodiak, discovered a chilling secret inside an abandoned bus. His claws scraped relentlessly at an old military trunk, revealing a false bottom. Beneath it, Caleb found the unexpected: an ammo can, sealed for 40 years, hiding a forgotten tragedy. What was hidden inside that box? What fate befell the family that vanished without a trace, leaving only this silent legacy? Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence of the suburbs had a noise all its own. It was a low hum of distant lawnmowers, the rhythmic sigh of sprinkler systems, and the cheerful, almost demanding chirp of birds that knew nothing of the world beyond their manicured kingdom. For Caleb Hayes, that silence was often louder than the drone of the C-132nd he had once flown in. Here, in the heart of a quiet Kansas neighborhood, the stillness was a void waiting to be filled by ghosts, and the only way to quiet them was to leave. He stood in his garage, the air thick with the scent of gasoline and old cedar. At 40 years old, Caleb wore his past like a well-worn coat. He was a tall man, with the lean but sturdy frame of someone whose strength was born from endurance, not just power. His brown hair, cut short in a way he never abandoned after the Air Force, was threaded with silver at the temples, a stark contrast to the quiet youthfulness that sometimes surfaced in his eyes. His face was rugged, carved by sun and worry, but a fundamental kindness softened the set of his jaw. He moved with a deliberate, practiced economy, each action a study in purpose. Right now, that purpose was the trip. It was his annual pilgrimage, his therapy, the only medicine that seemed to work. He carefully placed a heavy-duty canvas tent into the back of his pickup truck, securing it with a worn bungee cord. Beside it sat a cooler, 2 waterproof duffel bags, and a locked metal case containing his fishing gear. Everything had its place. Control was a comfort. A wet nose pressed against the back of his hand, and Caleb glanced down. Looking up at him with intelligent amber eyes was Kodiak, his inseparable companion. Kodiak was a 4-year-old German shepherd of striking appearance. Instead of the typical black and tan, his thick double coat was a swirl of wolf gray and brilliant white, giving him an almost ethereal look in the dim garage light. He was large for his breed, with a powerful chest and an alert, noble posture. But his temperament was one of gentle, unwavering loyalty. He sat patiently, his entire being focused on Caleb, waiting for the next signal, the next shared moment. Caleb reached down and scratched behind the dog's pointed ears. "Almost time, buddy," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. He had named him Kodiak, after the formidable bears of the Alaskan wilderness. It was a name that represented untamed strength, a symbol of the raw, powerful nature he sought on these journeys. It was everything the suburbs were not. It was a reminder of a world that was honest in its dangers and beautiful in its solitude. "Taking off again, Caleb?" The voice made Caleb straighten up. Mr. Henderson from next door stood at the edge of the driveway, leaning on a rake. He was a kind, retired mailman with a round belly and a perpetually cheerful disposition. "Morning, Mr. Henderson," Caleb said, his tone polite but reserved. "Just for a couple of weeks." "Good for you," the older man beamed. "Gotta use that vacation time. The wife and I are thinking about a cruise next year. You should try it sometime. All-you-can-eat shrimp, you know." Caleb offered a small, non-committal nod. He couldn't imagine a worse hell than being trapped on a floating city with thousands of people. The thought made the muscles in his shoulders tighten. He felt Kodiak shift beside him, leaning his weight against Caleb's leg. The dog always knew. He was a living, breathing anchor to the present moment, pulling Caleb back from the edge before he even realized he was drifting. "Sounds nice," Caleb managed to say. "You have a good day." And he gave Kodiak's head a final pat and turned back to his truck, a clear signal that the conversation was over. The ritual of packing was his shield. He checked the straps on the rooftop tent one last time, ensuring they were tight enough to withstand the highway winds. He ran a mental checklist of his supplies: water purifier, first aid kit, extra fuel, emergency rations. He was always prepared for the worst, It was a habit ingrained in him, a way of building a fortress against the chaos he felt lurking just beneath the surface of his carefully constructed life. This life, the one in the neat two-story house with the perfectly edged lawn, was an attempt at normalcy. It was a conscious effort, a daily performance for an audience that wasn't even watching. He went to work. He paid his bills. He nodded to his neighbors. He did all the things a man his age was supposed to do, but peace was not found in routine. It was found on the open road, in the vast, empty spaces where the sky was overwhelming and his own problems felt appropriately small. Finally, everything was ready. The garage was tidy, the house was locked, there was nothing left to do but go. "All right, Cody, load up." With a flick of his ears, Kodiak leaped gracefully into the passenger seat of the truck, turning in a tight circle before settling down, his head resting on the center console. His eyes remained fixed on Caleb. Alight with the same quiet anticipation, Caleb slid into the driver's seat, the familiar feel of the worn leather, a small comfort. He took one last look at the quiet street, at the identical houses lined up like soldiers at attention. He started the engine, the powerful rumble, a welcome disruption to the suburban hum. As he pulled out of the driveway and headed west, toward the promise of the Colorado Rockies, he felt the tight knot in his chest begin to loosen, just a little. The road was calling, and with his guardian sitting faithfully beside him, he was finally ready to answer. The world flattened as they drove west. Kansas bled into eastern Colorado, a vast, unending canvas of brown earth and pale sky. The highway was a black ribbon laid across the plains, stretching to an infinitely distant horizon. For hours the scenery was a hypnotic loop of grain silos, lonely farmhouses, and the skeletal remains of windmills. Caleb drove with a steady hand, the truck eating up the miles. In this immense exposed landscape, he felt like a solitary ship on a calm but boundless ocean. There was nowhere to hide. Kodiak seemed to sense it too. For the first day, he was quiet, mostly sleeping in the passenger seat or resting his head on the console, his warm breath fogging the corner of the window. He was a constant, reassuring weight beside Caleb, a silent promise that he was not alone in the emptiness. It was on the morning of the second day that things began to change. A faint, jagged line appeared in the west, a hazy purple suggestion against the sharp blue of the sky. At first, it was barely visible, a trick of the light. But as they drove on, the line grew, solidifying into the foothills and then the magnificent, snow-dusted peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Caleb felt a shift inside his own chest, a subtle release of pressure he hadn't even been aware of. He took a deep, clean breath, the first one that felt like it reached all the way to the bottom of his lungs. The flat, open plains had reflected his own internal landscape, a place of vulnerability and endless horizons where memories could ambush him from any direction. The mountains, however, were different. They were a fortress. They were a sanctuary. "Look at that, Cody," Caleb said softly. The dog's ears twitched, and he raised his head, his amber eyes following Caleb's gaze to the rising peaks. A low, happy whine rumbled in his throat. By afternoon, they were climbing. The air grew thinner and cooler, scented with the sharp, clean fragrance of pine. The straight, monotonous highway gave way to winding roads that hugged the sides of the mountains. The world was no longer flat and exposed, but vertical and enveloping. Towering pines and aspens with leaves of shimmering gold formed a dense canopy, the sunlight filtering through in dappled, shifting patterns. They had left the world of manicured lawns and noisy silence far behind. This was a different kind of quiet, a living silence filled with the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a hawk. They entered the boundaries of the Gunnison National Forest, the sign a welcome landmark. Caleb didn't head for the designated campgrounds with their numbered sites and concrete fire pits. He was looking for something else. He turned the truck onto a well-maintained gravel road, then onto a smaller, less traveled dirt track that branched off into the deep woods. For another hour, they bumped and jostled along the path, forging deeper into the heart of the forest until the sounds of any other vehicle had completely faded away. Finally, he found it. The track opened into a small, grassy clearing sheltered by a ring of ancient ponderosa pines. A clear, fast-moving stream gurgled happily along one edge, its water tumbling over smooth, gray stones. It was perfect. It was isolated, peaceful, and utterly wild. "This is it, buddy," Caleb announced. "Home for a while." He worked with the same methodical grace he had in his garage. He positioned the truck, unlatched the rooftop tent, and unfolded it into a neat, elevated shelter. While he worked, Kodiak explored their new territory with intense focus. His nose twitched, cataloging 1,000 new smells. He trotted to the edge of the stream, lapped at the cold water, and surveyed the surrounding woods with the proud bearing of a king inspecting his domain. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, Caleb had a small, crackling fire going. He sat in his canvas camp chair, a tin mug of coffee warming his hands, and watched the flames dance. Kodiak lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, his body relaxed but his senses still alert. The healing had begun. The first few days fell into a simple, peaceful rhythm. They woke with the sun, the mountain air so crisp it was a shock to the system. Mornings were for exploring. They would hike for miles along the stream, Caleb's boots crunching on fallen pine needles, Kodiak trotting ahead with his tail held high. Caleb's focus, usually scanning for threats, was now drawn to the small wonders around him. The iridescent blue of a dragonfly's wing, the intricate pattern of moss on a fallen log, the way the light caught the spray from a small waterfall. In the afternoons, Caleb would take his fly rod down to the stream. The repetitive motion of casting the line, the gentle art of placing the fly just so on the surface of the water, was a form of meditation. His mind, usually a turbulent storm of thoughts and memories, grew quiet, focused only on the line, the water, and the hope of a strike. He didn't care if he caught anything. The act itself was the reward. Evenings were the quietest time of all. After a simple meal cooked over the fire, Caleb would lean back in his chair and read from a worn paperback novel. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the murmur of the stream, and the gentle sigh of the wind. The ghosts that haunted his suburban home did not follow him here. There was no room for them. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the wilderness filled every empty space, leaving him feeling not small, but connected, a part of something vast and ancient and profoundly peaceful. He was, for the first time in a long time, simply present. For 4 days, a gentle peace settled over their small clearing. The rhythm of the wilderness became their own, a steady, predictable pulse of dawn, daylight, dusk, and darkness. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Caleb sat on a large, sun-warmed boulder by the stream, watching Kodiak. The dog was a picture of contentment, lying in a patch of clover with his paws crossed, occasionally snapping playfully at a butterfly that drifted too close. The air was warm, and the only sounds were the endless chatter of the water and the distant, rhythmic tapping of a woodpecker. The change was as sudden as a crack of lightning in a clear sky. Kodiak's head shot up, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. His body went rigid, every muscle tensed. A low, guttural whine escaped his throat, a sound Caleb had not heard since their arrival. He rose from his patch of clover, his playful demeanor vanishing completely, replaced by an intense, agitated focus. He stared fixedly up the side of the mountain, into a dense, trackless section of forest they had not yet explored. His nose twitched, sampling a scent on the breeze that was imperceptible to Caleb. "What is it, Cody?" Caleb asked, his own sense of peace evaporating. The dog ignored him. He took a few stiff-legged steps toward the trees, his gaze locked on something unseen. He let out a sharp, insistent bark, then turned to look at Caleb, his eyes burning with a clear, urgent message. He barked again, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the quiet afternoon, and then nudged Caleb's hand hard with his wet nose. He was not just alerting, he was demanding. Caleb stood up, his years of training kicking in. This was not the dog's usual reaction to a squirrel or a deer. This was something else entirely. It was the same unwavering certainty Kodiak displayed moments before Caleb's own night terrors would take hold. A primal instinct that something was profoundly wrong or out of place. He knew better than to ignore it. Trusting Kodiak was as natural as breathing. But he would not go in blind. The soldier inside him, the part that checklists and risk assessments had kept alive, took over. He glanced up at the sun, noting its position in the western sky. They had a few hours of good light left. He checked the small, reliable compass built into the band of his watch. He then walked back to the camp, grabbed his small, lightweight day pack, and confirmed its contents: a full bottle of water, a protein bar, a fire starter, and a powerful flashlight. Only then, prepared for an unknown journey, did he nod to his anxious companion. "All right, buddy," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Lead the way." Kodiak didn't hesitate. He plunged into the dense undergrowth at the base of the mountain, forcing Caleb to follow. There was no trail here. They pushed their way through thickets of wild raspberry bushes whose thorns snagged at Caleb's jeans. They scrambled over moss-covered rocks and ducked under the low-hanging branches of ancient pines. The terrain grew steeper, and soon Caleb's legs burned with the effort of the climb. Through it all, Kodiak moved with a relentless purpose, pausing only to make sure Caleb was still behind him before pressing onward. They followed the ghost of a dry creek bed for a time, its stony path offering slightly easier passage. Caleb could feel the atmosphere changing. The air grew stiller, the forest darker and more claustrophobic. The familiar, cheerful sounds of the woods faded away, replaced by an expectant hush. It felt like they were entering a place that had been sealed off from the world, a place that held its breath. After nearly an hour of strenuous climbing, Kodiak stopped abruptly. He stood at the edge of a wall of impossibly dense fir trees, their branches knitted so tightly together that they formed a dark green curtain. The dog whined softly, pawing at the ground, indicating that their destination lay just beyond. Caleb took a deep breath and pushed his way through the abrasive branches. He emerged into a small, shadowed clearing and stopped dead. It was a bus. A full-sized, old-fashioned school bus. Its iconic yellow paint faded to a sickly mustard color, large patches of it eaten away by rust that bled down its sides like old wounds. It was tilted at a strange angle, its front wheels sunk deep into the soft earth as if the forest were slowly swallowing it whole. Moss grew in thick velvety carpets on its roof, and tenacious vines snaked their way in and out of the shattered window frames. It was a jarring, unnatural monument in the heart of the wilderness. Caleb's mind, trained to analyze and understand, immediately began searching for an explanation. As his eyes adjusted, he saw it. Beneath the layers of pine needles and fallen leaves, there was the faint, unmistakable line of a roadbed. It was not a trail, but a wide, flat track, clearly man-made, that ended abruptly a few yards behind the bus in a jumble of rocks and earth, the clear evidence of an old landslide. The pieces clicked into place. This was an old service road, not meant for public travel. He remembered the canceled dam project he'd read about, a massive government undertaking from the late 1970s that was abandoned in the early 1980s due to budget cuts and environmental protests. This road would have been part of it. The bus must have been driven up here, and the landslide must have trapped it, cutting off its only escape. It was a relic, stranded and forgotten for nearly 40 years. Kodiak stood silently beside the bus's half-open door, no longer agitated. His work was done. He looked up at Caleb, his expression calm, as if to say, "Here, this is what I needed you to see." Caleb stared at the derelict vehicle, a strange mix of awe and unease settling over him. The peace of his trip had been irrevocably shattered, replaced by the profound and silent mystery of the metal ghost in the woods. The silence in the clearing was absolute. Caleb stood before the gaping doorway of the bus, a dark mouth that seemed to exhale a breath of cold, stale air. Kodiak stood beside him, his earlier agitation replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. The mystery was no longer a scent on the wind. It was a physical presence, a story waiting in the gloom. After a long moment, Caleb took a steadying breath and stepped forward. The rusted door groaned in protest as he pushed it further open, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. He ducked his head to enter, and the world outside vanished, replaced by shadow and the heavy, layered scent of decay. It was the smell of damp earth, of slowly rusting metal, and of decades of wet leaves turning to mulch. Kodiak followed close behind, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the metal floor, his nose twitching as he took in the history of the place. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed in through the broken windows, illuminating a scene of slow, methodical ruin. Nature had clearly tried to reclaim this space. Piles of brown, brittle leaves clogged the corners, and long, dark streaks of water stains marked the walls and ceiling where rain and melting snow had found their way in. A fine green dust of pollen and mold coated almost every surface. It was a tomb, Caleb thought at first, a place where something had simply come to an end. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw that he was wrong. It wasn't just an end, it was also a beginning. Beneath the layer of decay was the unmistakable skeleton of a home. The rows of passenger seats were long gone. In their place, someone had built a life with determined, resourceful hands. A small, sturdy table made from a thick slab of pine was bolted to the floor on one side. Opposite it, a long bench, fashioned from the same wood, served as seating. Further back, two narrow bunks were built against the walls, their simple frames a testament to function over form. On a set of crude shelves made from stacked wooden crates, a few tin cans stood in a neat row, their labels rotted away, leaving only cylinders of rust. Every object spoke of a relentless effort to carve out a space of comfort and order in the wilderness. This was not the work of a transient squatter. This was the work of a family, of someone trying to build a fortress against the lonely wild. In the far back corner stood a small pot-bellied wood stove, its pipe jutting awkwardly through a hole cut in the roof. Its cast-iron body was covered in a deep, flaky layer of orange rust, but Caleb could imagine the warmth it must have provided, a defiant beacon of heat against the brutal mountain winters. He ran a hand over its cold surface, feeling the grit of the rust on his fingertips. He thought of the person who had hauled this heavy object all the way up here, who had cut through the metal roof and sealed the pipe, all for the simple, profound comfort of a fire. It was then, as he turned back toward the front of the bus, that he saw them. On a large, flat panel of interior metal, just above the driver's area, was a splash of faded color. This part of the bus was more sheltered, the window beside it miraculously intact, protecting the wall from the worst of the elements. At first, Caleb thought it was just a strange pattern of discoloration in the old paint. But Kodiak seemed to notice his interest and padded silently over, sniffing at the base of the wall. Caleb moved closer. His curiosity piqued. He gently brushed a layer of fine dust from the surface with the side of his hand. The shapes beneath became clearer, their colors muted by time but their forms unmistakable. They were drawings, children's drawings, made with the clumsy, earnest strokes of a crayon. His breath caught in his throat. There was a crooked yellow sun with long, spidery rays shooting out in every direction. Beside it was a small, square house with a triangle roof and a puff of smoke curling from its chimney, a perfect, idealized image of a home drawn from inside this metal substitute. And next to the house were three stick figures, a tall one, a slightly smaller one, and a tiny one in the middle, all of them holding hands. Their faces were simple, happy circles. Caleb stared at the drawings, his heart aching with a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. All the other items, the stove, the table, the cans, spoke of survival, of a grim and practical struggle against the elements. But this was different. This spoke of a life being lived. It spoke of a child who, in this isolated, rusted shell, still had the imagination to draw a happy sun. It spoke of parents who had encouraged it, who had pinned this small, bright world to their wall to make this place feel less like a bus and more like a home. The fierce curiosity that had driven him up the mountain transformed into something deeper, something more personal. It became a profound and painful compassion. Who were they? Who was this child who drew smiling families in the middle of the lonely woods? What hopes and dreams had they brought with them to this place? And where had they gone? The questions flooded his mind, urgent and unanswered. He was no longer just a traveler who had stumbled upon a ruin. He was a witness, a guardian of a story that the forest had kept secret for nearly 40 years. He stood there for a long time, his hand hovering over the faded drawings as Kodiak leaned his solid weight against his leg, a silent, comforting presence in the echoing quiet of the bus. The simple crayon drawings held Caleb captive. He stood there for a long time, the dust motes swirling in the shafts of light, the silence of the bus pressing in around him. He was a soldier trained to see the world in terms of threats, objectives, and outcomes. But the stick figure family, smiling their simple circle smiles, disarmed him completely. They spoke a language of universal hope that cut through all his training, reaching a part of him he thought had been buried long ago. A child lived here. A child had been happy here. A quiet whine from Kodiak broke the spell. The dog had moved to the back of the bus and was sitting patiently beside the smaller of the two bunks, the one that was clearly meant for a child. It was as if he knew Caleb's attention needed to be drawn there next. Caleb followed, his steps slow and reverent, careful not to disturb the sacred dust of the place. Tucked beneath the simple wooden frame of the bunk was an old wooden box, something that might have once held apples or tools. Its sides were grayed with age, and a fine web of cracks ran through the wood. He knelt down, the floor groaning under his weight, and carefully pulled it out. The lid was not latched. He lifted it slowly. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves and pine needles that had likely blown in over the years, lay the remnants of a childhood. The first thing he saw was a small wooden car. It was crudely carved, its wheels simple wooden discs, its body painted a bright red that had since been worn down to a dull, faded pink on its corners and edges. Caleb picked it up. It was light in his hand, yet it felt heavy with the weight of imagined journeys across the metal floor, of small hands pushing it through imaginary landscapes, complete with the whispered sounds of a tiny engine. Beside the car lay what was left of a doll. It had been made of wool, but time and moisture had been unkind. It was now a fragile, almost ghostly shape. Caleb reached for it, but as his fingers brushed against the fabric, the delicate threads gave way, and the small figure seemed to sigh into a pile of faded, colorless fibers and dust. He pulled his hand back as if he had broken something precious. The sight of its quiet disintegration was a powerful, painful reminder of how fragile everything was, how easily a cherished object, and perhaps a life, could be unmade by time. He set the wooden car back in the box gently, a deep sense of sorrow settling in his chest. He felt like an intruder, a trespasser in the most private chambers of someone's life. It was as he pushed the box back under the bunk that his eyes caught something on the wooden frame of the window just above the small bed. They were faint, silvery lines etched into the dark, weathered wood, pencil marks. He leaned closer, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. They were not random scratches. They were a series of horizontal lines, each one placed carefully above the last. Beside each line were two things: a date, written in small, neat handwriting, and a name: Anna. His eyes traced the progression. The first line, near the bottom, was dated August 1982. The next one, a few inches higher, was August 1983. The dates continued, marking the passage of each year with a new line, each one a little higher than the last. He saw August 1984, August 1985. The final mark, the highest one, was dated August 1986. 986. And then, there were no more. Caleb stood up, a lump forming in his throat. It was a height chart, a loving, patient record of a little girl's growth, measured once a year on what was likely her birthday. This was not just a trace of life, this was proof of it. It was evidence of a family's quiet celebration, of parents watching their daughter grow taller and stronger in this wild, forgotten place. A powerful connection, stronger than anything he had felt yet, surged through him. He, Caleb, had spent years of his life dealing in endings. He had seen life in its final, brutal moments. He knew the geography of loss all too well. But this simple set of pencil marks on a wooden frame was the opposite. It was a testament to a life that was unfolding, a life that was growing, a life filled with the unspoken promise of a future. He reached out and gently traced the highest line, the one marked 1986, with his finger. He could almost feel the presence of the child, Anna, standing here proudly, her back straight against the wall as a father or a mother made the mark. He could almost hear their quiet laughter. The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. In that instant, the family was no longer anonymous. They had a daughter named Anna. They had loved her enough to measure her growth, year after year. They had hopes for her. He, a soldier who had tried to build walls around his own heart, found those walls crumbling. He felt a fierce, protective instinct rise within him, a need to know what had happened to this little girl. Why did the marks stop? The question hung in the silent, heavy air of the bus, a silent scream that echoed in the chambers of his own scarred heart. Caleb stood frozen by the window, his finger still tracing the faint pencil mark that represented the last recorded year of a little girl's life. August 1986. The date was a cliff edge, a sudden stop with a terrifying, unknown drop on the other side. The questions that had swirled in his mind quieted, replaced by a single, heavy feeling of sorrow. He was no longer just a curious stranger. He felt like a mourner, standing vigil in a place where a family's hope had been so carefully, so lovingly recorded. The sound that broke the silence was low and insistent, a soft scratching like nails on old wood. Caleb turned his head slowly. Kodiak was no longer sitting patiently. He was standing at the foot of the larger bunk, the one that must have belonged to the parents. His entire body was tense with purpose, his tail straight and low. In front of him was a dark green, metal-edged footlocker, a standard-issue military trunk from a bygone era. Faded stenciling on its side was no longer legible, but its rugged, functional shape was unmistakable. Kodiak whined again, a high, anxious sound. He sniffed intently along the seam of the lid, then raised a paw and scratched at the surface, his claws making a sharp, scraping sound. He looked back at Caleb, his amber eyes wide and urgent. The message was as clear as a spoken command. "Look here." Caleb's grief was momentarily pushed aside by a surge of adrenaline. He knew that look. He had seen it before on missions, the unwavering focus of a trained dog that had found something vital. He moved away from the window and knelt beside Kodiak, placing a calming hand on the dog's powerful shoulders. "Easy, boy. What did you find?" He ran his hands over the trunk's cold, dusty surface. The latches were rusted but not locked. With a metallic groan, he lifted the heavy lid. A musty smell, like old wool and damp earth, rose from within. The contents seemed mundane, almost disappointing. There were 2 neatly folded wool blankets, now riddled with moth holes. Beneath them lay a man's flannel shirt and a pair of worn denim jeans. It looked like nothing more than simple storage. But Kodiak was not satisfied. He nudged Caleb's hand with his nose and then pushed his snout into the now empty trunk, sniffing aggressively at the bottom. The scratching began again, this time with more force, his claws scraping against the thin wooden liner at the base. Caleb frowned, his curiosity reignited. He leaned closer, running his own fingers over the bottom of the trunk. At first, he felt nothing but rough, splintered wood. Then his fingertips brushed against it. a subtle, almost invisible seam running along the edges. It wasn't part of the trunk's original construction. It was a false bottom. His heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. His military training had taught him all about hidden compartments. They were used for hiding things of great importance, things that needed to be protected at all costs. He pulled his multi-tool from his belt and selected the pry bar attachment. He worked carefully, inserting the tip into the faint crack and gently applying pressure. The old wood resisted, stiff with decades of disuse. With a final, reluctant crack, the board lifted. Beneath it was a shallow, hidden space. And nestled perfectly within that space was an object that made the air leave Caleb's lungs in a sudden rush. It was a package, wrapped with meticulous care in a thick, heavy sheet of dark green waxed canvas. The fabric was stiff and smelled faintly of oil and age, its purpose clear, to provide a final, desperate barrier against the relentless mountain moisture. Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the bundle out. It was heavier than he expected. He placed it on the floor of the bus and slowly, carefully, unfolded the stiff corners of the canvas. The object inside was a dark, olive-drab metal box, an ammo can. Specifically, a .50 caliber ammunition can. Its sturdy steel construction and rubber gasket, designed to be completely airtight, to protect its deadly contents from the worst conditions imaginable. Caleb, the Air Force veteran, understood the significance instantly. A soldier's tools were sacred. You used the right tool for the right job. And if the job was to protect the most precious, irreplaceable part of your life, you used the strongest, most secure container you had. You used an ammo can. The man who had lived here, the father of the little girl named Anna, had taken a tool of war and repurposed it to serve as an ark, a time capsule to safeguard his family's memory. The sheer, desperate care of the act was a gut punch. It spoke of foresight, of love, and perhaps of a terrible fear that this was the only way their story would ever survive. Caleb knelt there on the dusty floor, the heavy metal box before him, his hand resting on its cold surface. He didn't open it. Not yet. He simply stared at it, the weight of the secrets it held pressing down on him, a silent sentry guarding the heart of a world forgotten. Time seemed to have stopped inside the bus. Caleb knelt on the floor, the heavy ammo can cold beneath his hands. Outside, the sun was beginning its slow descent, and the light filtering through the broken windows shifted from bright white to a soft, golden hue. Kodiak sat beside him, a silent, watchful presence, his body a warm and solid anchor in the echoing silence. For a long moment, Caleb did not move. He felt the profound gravity of the moment, the sense that he was about to cross a threshold from which there was no return. With a deep breath, he reached for the latch. It was stiff, but it gave way with a loud, metallic snap. He lifted the lid, and as the rubber gasket broke its seal for the first time in nearly 4 decades, there was a faint but distinct hiss. It was the sound of preserved air, of a single moment from 1986 escaping to meet the present. A dry, musty scent rose from the container, the smell of old paper, leather, and forgotten time. The contents were packed with the same meticulous care as the box itself. On top lay a small stack of photographs, tied together with a piece of faded twine. Beneath them was a bundle of letters, held together by a thin, brittle ribbon. And at the very bottom, taking up most of the space, was a thick, leather-bound journal. Caleb's hands were steady as he lifted the photographs out. He untied the twine with gentle fingers. The top image was of a young couple, squinting happily in the sun. The man had kind eyes and a thick mustache, his arm wrapped protectively around a woman with long dark hair and a radiant smile. Another photo showed the same couple, this time holding a small baby wrapped in a thick blanket. And then there was one of the man alone, much younger, in a crisp military uniform, a haunted look in his eyes that Caleb recognized all too well. He set the photos aside and reached for the journal. Its dark brown leather cover was cool and smooth to the touch, remarkably preserved. He opened it, and the old pages crackled in protest. They were severely yellowed at the edges and brittle with age, but the handwriting within was clear and strong, a disciplined cursive written with dark blue ink. He turned to the first page. The Journal of David Miller, June 1982, our first day. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. David. He had a name. He began to read, and the world outside the bus, his own world, faded away completely. The first entries were filled with a powerful, infectious optimism. David, a Vietnam veteran, wrote about his profound disillusionment with the world he had come home to. He wrote of the noise, the chaos, the lingering shadows of a war nobody wanted to remember. His dream was to escape it all, to take his wife, Sarah, and their infant daughter, Anna, and build a new life, a pure life, a life connected to the earth. He wanted to raise his daughter in a place where the only sounds were the wind and the river, a place where she could grow up strong and free, untouched by the cynicism of the world he had fought for. An instant, powerful wave of empathy washed over Caleb. He, a veteran of a different, sand-choked war, understood every word as if he had written them himself. He knew that desperate, soul-deep yearning for a silence that was not empty, but full of peace. He knew the desire to build something good and whole to counteract the brokenness he had witnessed. Reading David's words was like listening to a conversation between two soldiers who had never met, but who shared the same scars and the same desperate hope for redemption. He read for what felt like hours, completely engrossed. He read about their first summer in the bus, the joy of catching fish in the stream, the struggle of planting a small garden. He read about Sarah's laughter and Anna's first steps on the bus's metal floor. The journal was filled with love, a quiet, resilient love that flourished in this isolated world. Then, as he flipped further into the book, the tone began to change. The entries grew shorter, more sporadic. The hopeful prose was replaced by stark, practical observations about the weather, the dwindling food supply, and the first signs of a winter that arrived too early and refused to leave. Caleb's fingers trembled slightly as he turned to the last few pages. The handwriting, once so steady, was now shaky, hurried. The final entries were a harrowing chronicle of their desperate struggle. November 1986. The snow is already 3 feet deep. The trap lines are empty. December 1986. Sarah's cough is worse. The firewood is running low. I am so tired. The final entry was dated just after Christmas. The ink was slightly blurred, as if a tear had fallen on the page. The 27th of December, 1986. The fever won't break. Sarah is weak, and Anna is so frightened. The food is almost gone. I have failed them. Tomorrow, if she has the strength, Sarah will try to take Anna and walk down the mountain for help. I do not think I can make the journey. I am leaving this here, in the hope that if we do not return, someone will one day find it and know that we lived and that we loved. Caleb closed the journal. The final words hung in the air, a devastating epitaph. He now knew their story. He knew their names, their dreams, and their desperate end. The bus was no longer a mystery. It was a memorial. He sat there in the encroaching twilight, the heavy journal resting in his lap, the weight of a family's entire world entrusted to him. Kodiak shifted, resting his heavy head on Caleb's knee, a silent gesture of comfort for a sorrow that was almost too much to bear. Caleb did not sleep. He sat by the dying embers of his campfire all night, the open journal resting on his lap, Kodiak's head, a heavy, comforting weight, on his thigh. The story of the Miller family played over and over in his mind. David, Sarah, and little Anna. They were no longer ghosts. They were real people whose final, desperate moments had been entrusted to him. The peace he had sought in the wilderness was gone, replaced by a heavy sense of duty. He could not let their story remain a silent secret, swallowed by the forest. At first light, he moved with a renewed purpose. He carefully placed the journal, the letters, and a single, clear photograph of the family back into the ammo can. He then placed the can itself deep inside his pack. He broke down his camp with swift, efficient motions, leaving the small clearing exactly as he had found it. As the sun rose over the mountain peaks, the truck was packed, and they were on the move, bumping back down the dirt track toward civilization. Their destination was the small town he had seen on the map, Silver Creek. It was nestled in a narrow valley, a collection of old brick and wooden buildings that looked like they had stood firm against a century of harsh winters. A single main street ran through its center, lined with storefronts that had changed little over the decades. It was a town that felt steeped in its own history, a place where memories might be held as tightly as the mountains that surrounded it. He found what he was looking for at the end of the street, the Silver Creek Historical Society and Museum. It was a humble, single-story building made of dark, sturdy timber, a former mining payroll office, according to the plaque by the door. Leaving Kodiak in the truck with the windows cracked and a bowl of fresh water, Caleb stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and time itself. The room was filled with glass display cases containing mining tools, faded photographs of stern-looking pioneers, and artifacts from the town's founding. A woman sat behind a large wooden desk, her head bent over a thick, leather-bound ledger. She looked up as he entered, her eyes sharp and intelligent behind a pair of silver-rimmed glasses. She was likely in her late 70s, with a cloud of neatly coiffed white hair and a posture that was surprisingly straight and alert. A simple, hand-carved nameplate on her desk read, "Martha Finch, Curator." "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Can I help you?" Caleb felt a knot of uncertainty in his stomach. He suddenly felt foolish, a stranger walking in with a wild story. "I hope so," he began, his voice hesitant. "My name is Caleb Hayes. I'm a visitor, just camping up in the National Forest. I found something, and I was hoping you might know something about it." Martha's expression was patient, professional. "We get a lot of folks who find old bottles or mining relics. What did you find?" Caleb took a deep breath. A bus. An old school bus, stranded way up on a washed-out service road. It was turned into a home. He paused, then decided to lay it all out. "I also found this." He carefully pulled the photograph of the Millers from his pocket and placed it on the desk. "And a journal. It belonged to the father, a man named David Miller. He was a veteran, from Vietnam." He watched her face closely. At the mention of the bus, her expression remained neutral. But when he said the name, and especially when he mentioned that David was a veteran, a subtle flicker of something shifted in her sharp eyes. A vague memory, a ghost of a story from long ago, had been stirred. She picked up the photograph, holding it delicately by its edges. She stared at the smiling faces for a long time. "Miller," she murmured, testing the name on her tongue. "And he was a veteran, you say?" "Yes, ma'am," Caleb confirmed. Martha looked up from the photo, her gaze distant. "I remember something," she said slowly, her voice softer now. "It was a long time ago. People in town called them the homesteaders on the mountain, a young family. They kept to themselves. Everyone thought they were a bit strange, wanting to live up there all year round, especially with a little girl." Compelled by the vague memory, she stood up with a new energy. "Come with me," she said, her professional curiosity now fully engaged. She led him through a doorway into a small back room, a cramped archive filled with tall metal filing cabinets and cardboard boxes stacked high. "If there's a record of them, it will be in here. It ought to. It no matey." For the next half hour, she worked with the focused determination of a true historian. She pulled out heavy drawers, her fingers flying through old files. Caleb stood by, a silent, anxious observer. Finally, she stopped at a large, flat drawer, labeled Newspapers, 1985 to 1990. She carefully lifted out a stack of yellowed, brittle newspapers, the local Silver Creek Chronicle, and laid them on a table. "After a winter like the one we had in 1986, people would take stock," she explained, her voice muffled as she scanned the pages. If someone from up in the mountains hadn't been seen for a while, the sheriff would organize a party to check on them come spring. Her fingers stopped on a headline partway down a page. She turned the newspaper so Caleb could see. The date at the top read the 12th of April, 1987. The headline was stark. Search for missing family called off. There was a grainy photograph of a snow-covered landscape. The article detailed the brief, unsuccessful search for the Miller family. It mentioned their abandoned truck found near the trailhead and the impassable snowpack that had hampered the search party. The final paragraph concluded that the authorities believed the family had likely packed up and moved on before the worst of the snow had hit, leaving no forwarding address. Caleb stared at the article. Here it was. The official story. A neat, tidy explanation that closed the case and allowed the town to forget. He looked at the date. This was months after David had written his final desperate entry in the journal. He was now holding the public record, and in his pack, he held the private, tragic truth. The two pieces of the story, separated by almost 40 years, had finally been brought together. The archive room was silent, save for the faint hum of an old fluorescent light overhead. Caleb stared at the brittle newspaper, the stark black and white text providing the town's final, incorrect word on the Miller family. They had moved on. A simple, clean explanation that allowed life in Silver Creek to continue, untroubled by the fate of the homesteaders on the mountain. But Caleb held the truth in his pack, a truth far more complex and heartbreaking. Martha looked from the newspaper back to Caleb, her expression a mixture of professional curiosity and gentle sadness. That winter, the winter of 1986, was one of the worst on record, she said softly, her memory stirring. The snows came early and didn't stop. We were cut off for weeks at a time. A lot of old-timers still talk about it. Her words painted a grim backdrop to the final, desperate entries in David's journal. Caleb knew he couldn't keep the rest of the story to himself. This woman, this guardian of the town's memory, deserved to know the truth. He reached into his pack and carefully pulled out the ammo can. From it, he retrieved the small bundle of letters. The newspaper was wrong, Caleb said, his voice low and heavy. They didn't leave. He sorted through the letters until he found the one on top. It was in a different handwriting, a graceful, flowing script. The envelope was addressed to a woman in Ohio, but it had never been sealed, never been sent. He unfolded the single, fragile page. This is from his wife Sarah, he explained. He began to read her last words aloud, his voice filling the quiet room. The letter was a heart-wrenching mix of love and terror. She wrote to her sister, telling her how much she missed her, telling her not to worry, that they were strong. But the confident tone quickly frayed, revealing the desperation beneath. She wrote of David's illness, a fever that had settled deep in his lungs, leaving him too weak to even chop wood. She described the endless, howling wind and the snow that had buried their world in a deep, white silence. Then came the final, terrible paragraph. She wrote of their decision. David was too sick to travel. Their food was nearly gone. She was going to take Anna and try to walk out, to follow the stream down the mountain in the hope of reaching a logging road. I am so scared, Caleb read, his own voice thick with emotion. But I have to do it. For our little girl. Kiss the kids for me. Tell them about their cousin Anna. I will write again as soon as we get to town. All my love, Sarah. When he finished, a profound, heavy silence settled over the room. Martha had her hand pressed to her mouth, her sharp eyes glistening with unshed tears. The newspaper's tidy explanation lay exposed for what it was, a comforting lie. The truth was so much worse. They had not simply disappeared. They had been defeated in a final, valiant battle against an unforgiving wilderness. Sarah and Anna had walked out into a blizzard, a desperate gamble for survival, while David, the soldier who had survived one war, was left to face his end alone in the cold silence of the bus. Caleb felt the full, crushing weight of it. He was the sole inheritor of this truth. The town had its legend. The newspaper had its official record, but he was the only person on earth who knew the whole story. He knew of their dreams, of David's search for peace, of Sarah's strength, of Anna's lovingly recorded growth. He was no longer just the discoverer of a secret, he was its keeper. The responsibility felt immense, a sacred trust passed to him across the decades. And in that moment of crushing responsibility, a profound realization dawned on him. He looked at the story of David Miller, and for the first time, he truly saw himself. David was a soldier from a different generation, a different war, but his struggle was Caleb's own. David had returned from the jungles of Vietnam to a world that no longer made sense, a world whose noise he tried to escape by building a physical fortress deep in the woods. Caleb had returned from the deserts of Afghanistan and tried to do the same, only his fortress was mobile, a truck and a tent that he used to chase the same elusive peace across the country. Both of them were soldiers haunted by the ghosts of what they had seen, both seeking a quiet place to heal. Both had tried to build something pure and good to counteract the destruction that had been seared into their souls. The parallel was so clear, so powerful, it left him breathless. He understood David's hope, and now he understood his despair. Their lives were two sides of the same coin, two soldiers on the same lonely journey, separated only by time. He carefully folded Sarah's letter and placed it back with the others. The pieces were all there. The puzzle was complete, its final image one of love, sacrifice, and unbearable tragedy. He looked at Martha, whose face was a mask of sorrowful understanding. They were now the only two people who knew what really happened on the mountain. Caleb left the historical society with a quiet nod to Martha. No more words were necessary. In their shared silence, a pact had been made. She was the keeper of the town's public record, and he was now the guardian of the private truth. He walked back to his truck, the weight of the story heavy on his shoulders, and found Kodiak waiting, his tail giving a soft, steady thump against the passenger seat. The drive back to his campsite was a blur of pine and winding roads. The mission that had propelled him to Silver Creek was complete, replaced by a new, final objective. He did not linger at his camp. He packed a few essentials, doused the last of his campfire, and, with Kodiak at his side, began the final pilgrimage up the mountain. The forest felt different this time. It was no longer a place of mystery, but one of solemnity. Every rustle of leaves, every ray of light filtering through the canopy, seemed to be a part of the Miller family's story. When they finally reached the clearing, the bus stood waiting in the late afternoon light, a silent, patient sentinel. Caleb stood before it, the ammo can held respectfully in both hands. Now came the question that had been circling in his mind for hours. What was the right thing to do? The soldier in him, the man who followed procedure, argued for reporting it. He should call the sheriff, hand over the journal, and let the authorities take over. There would be an investigation, an official record, perhaps a proper burial for whatever remains might be found. It was the correct, orderly thing to do. But as he looked at the bus, so perfectly assimilated into the landscape, a powerful counter-argument rose from his heart. He imagined the scene, the yellow tape, the forensics teams, the news crews tromping through this quiet clearing. He imagined the story of David, Sarah, and Anna becoming a sensationalized headline. Their private struggle turned into a public curiosity. Their sanctuary, the place where they had loved and hoped and fought so desperately to live, would be reduced to an investigation scene. His decision came with a quiet certainty. David Miller had brought his family here to escape the noise and chaos of a world that did not understand his scars. He had sought peace. It would be the ultimate betrayal to posthumously drag him and his family back into that noise. Their story did not belong to the world. It belonged here, in the heart of the forest that had held it for so long. His duty was not to report, it was to protect. He would be their silent sentry, the guardian of their peace. With his path clear, he stepped inside the bus one last time. He walked to the back, to the military trunk, at the foot of the parents' bunk. He lifted the false bottom and gently placed the ammo can back in its hiding place. He laid the faded photograph of the family on top of it before covering it with the wooden panel. He was not burying their story. He was returning it to its resting place, safe and whole. Then he went back outside. The final task remained. He walked to the dry creek bed and began to gather stones. He chose them carefully, smooth, gray, and flat, worn by years of mountain water. He carried them, 2 or 3 at a time, to a small, level spot, a few yards from the front of the bus, a place that caught the last rays of the setting sun. Kodiak seemed to understand the solemnity of the task. He stayed close, occasionally nudging a loose stone with his nose, or simply sitting and watching his human with profound, unwavering attention. For over an hour, Caleb worked. He laid a solid foundation and began to build upwards, placing each stone with care. The physical labor was a release, a prayer in motion. With each stone he placed, he thought of the family. A large, solid stone for David's strength. A smooth, rounded one for Sarah's love. A small, bright piece of quartz for Anna's light. It was not a grave, but a monument. A cairn. A simple, ancient marker that said, "Something important is here. Remember." As he placed the final stone on top, the sun dipped below the mountain ridge, and the clearing was bathed in a soft, purple twilight. He stood back, his hands aching, his body tired, but his heart, for the first time in as long as he could remember, was quiet. The heavy burden of the story had transformed. It was no longer a weight of sorrow, but a grounding sense of purpose. In honoring their struggle, he had somehow come to terms with his own. In protecting their peace, he had found his. He knelt and wrapped his arms around Kodiak's thick neck, burying his face in the dog's soft fur. "Thank you, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick. When they finally turned to leave, Caleb took one last look back. The bus was sinking into the shadows, and the small stone cairn stood dark against the fading light, a permanent testament to a life and a love that would no longer be forgotten. As they walked back down the mountain in the growing darkness, Caleb no longer felt like a man haunted by the past. He felt like a man carrying a legacy. The journey that had begun as an escape had become a homecoming. He was not just returning to his life, he was returning to himself, whole and at peace, with a silent, steadfast guardian walking faithfully by his side. Sometimes the deepest stories are not found in books, but are waiting patiently in the quietest corners of the world, held in whispers of love and loyalty that echo through time. The tale of the Miller family is a reminder that even when a life is forgotten, the love within it is never truly lost. We would be honored to read about the discoveries that have touched your own life in the comments below. If their story moved you, please consider sharing it and subscribing to our channel so that these memories can continue to find a voice. The journey does not end here. Another incredible story is waiting for you in the video that has just appeared on your screen.